There was a hidden clock beneath the palace, not a real clock, not with gears and hands, but a pressure, a sound, a quiet, constant ticking that no one else seemed to hear. King Ahaz heard it every day. When the scribes spoke too slowly, when his advisors took too long to decide, when he stood before the mirror adjusting his crown and saw the sweat on his own forehead. Tick, tick, tick. Time was running out. The armies from the north had already marched through the border towns, Syria and Israel, working together now. Strange as that was, cities were burning, villages emptied. Judah was shrinking day by day. Ahaz sat in a high-backed chair made of cedar and brass, his elbows on his knees, his fingers interlocked tightly, the knuckles bone white. Around him, the room of stones echoed with low, sharp voices, generals, commanders, men who always smelled like steel and smoke. Maps littered the table. A carved lion statue lay on its side, knocked over during a shouting match 2 days ago. "We're outnumbered," said Commander Almach, pacing hard. "No," said one of the older advisors. "We're outmaneuvered." Ahaz stood up slowly. "We're out of time." The room fell quiet. The king walked to the window. Not a poetic balcony, but a stone slit in the war room wall. From there, he could see the edge of the outer fortifications. Beyond that, nothing but fields and dust and fire. He didn't turn as he spoke. "Have they responded?" "Yes, Your Majesty," said a tall man in dark red robes, Yorim, the foreign affairs minister. "The king of Assyria received our message." "And?" Ahaz whispered. Yoram's voice was careful. "They'll help. But they want something in return." Ahaz turned slowly. "How much silver?" Yoram hesitated. The room stilled again. Almach finally answered. "They want the temple gold, sire. All of it. From the doors, the frames, the treasury. They also want a permanent trade route through our land and a place to build their own shrine." Someone in the back cursed under his breath. Ahaz didn't blink. "Do it!" "My king!" One of the priests objected. Ahaz raised a hand. "Do it! I'd rather owe Assyria than be dead in a week." Silence. A pigeon cooed somewhere in the rafters, its cry thin and hollow. "You're putting your trust in tyrants," the priest muttered. Ahaz's eyes locked on him. "I'm putting my trust in swords and walls and whatever it takes to survive." He left the room before they could argue further, but the tick in his chest only got louder. Outside the war room, Ahaz walked down the spiral steps to the lower chamber, past the armory, past the scribes. He passed a wall where someone had once scratched a phrase long ago, "God is our refuge." It was old, faded, probably from the time of Uzziah, his grandfather. He paused, but only for a second. Then he kept walking toward a sealed chamber, a vault, a place few ever entered. Inside was a scroll, a letter from a man who claimed to speak for God. The scroll had been hand-delivered a week ago by a young boy with shaking hands. Ahaz hadn't opened it, but he knew who it was from. Isaiah. He had heard the name in the palace before, always whispered like a warning. Don't anger the prophet. Don't ignore him too long. He speaks for the Lord. But Ahaz didn't like prophets. Prophets didn't understand war. They didn't understand pressure. They didn't hear the ticking clock. But that night, long after the voices faded and the council scattered, Ahaz finally opened the scroll. Just 4 words. "Ask me for anything." His hands trembled, not with fear, but with anger. If God really wanted to help, why hadn't he already? He crushed the scroll and threw it into the brazier. The flames took it quickly, but the words burned slower. Ahaz didn't sleep the night after the prophet's visit. He lay still on the woven mat, eyes open in the dark, heart pounding like a war drum. Every whisper from the palace walls felt like judgment. Every creak in the cedar beams above sounded like the groan of God's disappointment. The words Isaiah had spoken echoed through him like wind in an empty chamber. Ask for a sign, Ahaz. Anything, heaven above or earth below. And he had said no, because he had already made up his mind. At dawn, before the servants lit the lamps or the priests began their morning songs, Ahaz summoned the captain of the guard and gave an order that hadn't been spoken in generations. "Open the sacred vault," he said flatly. The captain blinked in confusion. "Sire, the lower chamber hasn't been entered since King Uzziah. It holds the relics of Solomon, the altar of—" "I know what it holds," Ahaz cut in, eyes hard. "Open it." They obeyed. They always did. The heavy bronze doors groaned like a beast waking from sleep. A hush fell over the chamber as light spilled across ancient stone, revealing treasures wrapped in dust and silence. Golden bowls, incense burners, the 7-branched lampstand, and in the back, resting beneath faded linen, was the old bronze altar, cold and untouched. Ahaz stepped inside the room, his sandals scraping the stone floor. For a long time, he said nothing. He only stared. The altar was beautiful, crafted for God, forged in reverence, but in his eyes, it looked like failure. "So much tradition," he muttered bitterly, "so much history. And where did it leave us? Surrounded by enemies, empty coffers, no allies, no answers." He turned to his steward and spoke the words that would change everything. "Send a message to Tiglath-Pileser. Tell him Judah is ready to serve. I'll do whatever it takes." By evening, the envoys from Assyria had arrived. They wore robes stitched with lion symbols and spoke with thick accents, but they carried themselves like kings. One of them, an older man with iron bracelets and laugh lines that didn't reach his eyes, stepped forward and introduced himself as Carmel. "We've heard of your city," Carmel said, strolling through the temple court with casual arrogance. "Judah, the land of kings. But forgive me, I expected something taller." Ahaz did not rise to the insult. He simply motioned for the guards to remain still. Carmel opened a leather case and unrolled a scroll across the ground. "Our king sends this gift. The design for an altar, not like yours, bigger, stronger, fit for an empire." The drawing showed a massive structure, iron-laced, carved with foreign gods, and shaped in brutal angles. It looked nothing like the sacred altars of Israel. It was a monument to power. "This," Carmel said with a smile, "is what success looks like." One of the temple priests stepped forward timidly. "We already have an altar, built by divine instruction." Carmel's smile widened, but his tone darkened. "Then move it, or move aside." Late that night, long after the Assyrians had left, Ahaz found himself alone in the inner courts. No musicians, no crowd, just a flickering lamp and the altar, God's altar, still standing at the center. He walked slowly to its edge, his fingertips brushing the cool metal. "I'm not a prophet," he whispered. "I don't have dreams. I don't see visions. I have enemies, and they are real. If God wanted to save us, why wait this long?" He turned away from the altar, jaw clenched. This isn't betrayal, it's survival. And with that, he gave the final order. "Move it!" Replace it. By sunrise, the Assyrian altar stood at the front of the temple. It towered in the light, catching the attention of every passerby. The priests looked on in horror. The people whispered in confusion. Some admired its size. Others turned their faces away. But Ahaz stood beside it, arms folded, face unreadable. Across the courtyard, cloaked in the shadows of a narrow corridor, stood the prophet Isaiah. He said nothing. He did not shout or wave his arms or cry out judgment. He simply watched, because he knew what Ahaz did not. When a man trades God's presence for foreign protection, it's not just stone that's moved. It's destiny. The morning after the new altar was installed, the palace buzzed like a nest kicked too hard. Some praised the king for boldness. Others whispered in corners, eyes darting toward the heavens. And somewhere, tucked between the old stone corridors of the temple, Isaiah stood watching it all, silent and still, like a tree refusing to bend with the storm. He had not come to scold Ahaz. He had come to offer him one last chance. Isaiah waited near the priest's chambers until the hour of sacrifice had passed. The new altar had been bloodied. Smoke rose into the sky, not sweet like incense, but acrid, metallic, and wrong. The people could smell it. So could heaven. When Ahaz stepped outside to return to the palace, Isaiah emerged from the shadows, his robe dusty and simple, his eyes sharp with something deeper than anger, grief. The guards froze, unsure whether to draw swords or bow. But Ahaz lifted a hand. Let him speak. Isaiah's voice was quiet, but it cut deep. You've done it, he said. You've chosen your protector. Ahaz didn't flinch. You prophets always speak in riddles. Isaiah stepped closer. The Assyrians won't protect you, Ahaz. They'll swallow you. You've invited a lion into the sheepfold. Ahaz looked past him, toward the crowd milling in the court. I chose what any king would choose, he said. Strength, order, help in the real world, not parables and poetry. Isaiah's face hardened. God offered you help, real help. You refused. You didn't just move an altar, Ahaz. You've moved the boundary between covenant and compromise. Ahaz's voice rose, a crack of thunder against stone. And where has covenant gotten us? Surrounded, starving, alone. I'm not like Hezekiah or David. I am a king in a crumbling world. Don't speak to me about signs unless you've seen the hunger in children's eyes. For a moment, Isaiah was quiet. Then he said, There will be a sign. You refused it, but it will come anyway. A child, born of a virgin, God with us. He will not be born in your courts or raised in your palace, but he will reign. And unlike you, he will not trade trust for treaties. Ahaz turned away, his jaw tight. We're done here. Isaiah didn't follow. He only looked up, past the new altar, past the temple roof, past the sky itself. And as Ahaz's footsteps faded down the corridor, Isaiah whispered a name, Emmanuel. That night, Ahaz couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of what Isaiah had said. A child? A sign? It was nonsense, and yet it lingered. He got up and paced the balcony, watching the moon rise over the rooftops. Far below, soldiers stood watch at every gate. Assyrian flags fluttered beside the royal seal. Judah looked strong, safer, different. But something still gnawed at the corners of his soul, a question he wouldn't say aloud. What if I was wrong? He turned from the view and ordered the torches put out. Darkness returned to the palace, but the prophet's words still burned behind his eyes. At first, the alliance seemed like a gift wrapped in gold. Tribute was sent to Assyria, silver, spices, even the temple's sacred treasures. In return, the Assyrian king sent his armies. They stormed into Aram like a desert storm, crushing Rezin's forces with brutal precision. The people of Judah watched from their rooftops as smoke rose on the northern horizon and cried out in relief. The threat was gone. For the first time in months, Ahaz stood on his balcony and felt victorious. But alliances, like debts, always come with small print. The messengers arrived within days, stern-faced officials in black and bronze, their scrolls bound with Assyrian seals and their words thick with conditions. "You will keep the gods of Assyria," one declared, his voice slow and deliberate. "You will build altars for them across your land, one in every high place, one in every town, one in your temple beside your own." Ahaz's smile faltered. That wasn't part of the agreement. The messenger blinked, unmoved. "That is the agreement." And just like that, the king, who thought he had secured peace, realized he had signed away something far deeper. Ahaz walked back through the palace, slower now. The walls of cedar and carved stone felt colder than usual. The fire pits burned, but he could feel no warmth. He passed by the royal court where advisors waited with scrolls and figures, but he waved them away. What he needed wasn't strategy or numbers. He needed silence, a place to think. He found it in the private chambers of his late father, Jotham. The room had been sealed since the funeral. Dust layered every surface. The old man's robe still hung in the corner, untouched. Ahaz had avoided this room for years, but now something pulled him there. Not nostalgia, not grief, just memory. He sat on the bench beside the cold hearth and stared into the empty space. His father had warned him. A kingdom built on foreign favors is not a kingdom at peace, Jotham used to say. It's a kingdom on a leash. Ahaz had rolled his eyes at those words then, but now they sounded less like a warning and more like prophecy. There was a knock. Not loud, not from a servant. A hesitant tapping, like someone unsure they belonged. Ahaz stood, heart tightening. "Enter!" A boy slipped inside, barely old enough to be called a man. One of the priest's assistants, draped in a simple linen tunic, his face pale. "My lord," he said, breathless, "the Assyrians, they're ordering sacrifices to their gods in the temple court." Ahaz closed his eyes. He had expected this, hadn't he? Somewhere deep down. Still, the confirmation was a blade to the gut. "And the priests?" he asked. "They're refusing," the boy said quietly. "They say the holy things are not to be shared. Some are talking of revolt." Ahaz opened his eyes, slow and weary. "And what do you say?" The boy blinked. "I say, they're right. But I also say, I'm afraid." The king stood there for a moment, silent. Then he did something unexpected. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "So am I." For a heartbeat, they stood like that, two frightened souls in a palace that once belonged to kings who trusted Yahweh alone. Then Ahaz stepped back. "Send word to the high priest. Tell him. I'll speak with him myself." The boy nodded and slipped away. And Ahaz sat again in the dark chamber, haunted by voices past and the silence of a God he had stopped seeking. He was winning wars, yes, But somewhere deep within, he had begun losing himself. The high priest's chambers were tucked behind the outer court, built of stone older than any scroll in the archives. The walls whispered of kings who once bowed before the ark, of songs David had sung, of sacrifices offered with trembling hands and holy awe. But now, the incense was stale. The lamps flickered. And Ahaz stood in the doorway like a stranger who didn't belong. The high priest, Azariah, was kneeling when the king entered, back straight, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if looking past it into heaven itself. He didn't rise when he heard Ahaz's footsteps. He didn't even flinch. He simply whispered his final prayer, then slowly stood, robes heavy with age and meaning. "You summon me," Azariah said, voice lined with gravel and dignity. Ahaz crossed the stone floor slowly, his sandals echoing louder than he liked. "Number I came myself. I wanted to look you in the eye." Azariah turned, his eyes gray as smoke. "Then speak plainly, my king." There was a pause, longer than either of them expected. "They want an altar," Ahaz said finally, "in the temple, to their god, to Molech, and others. I need it built." The old priest's face didn't move. No shout, no gasp, only silence. And then finally, "You mean to place filth beside the presence of the Holy One?" Ahaz's jaw tightened. "I mean to survive. Do you know what Assyria does to those who defy them? Do you know what I've seen?" "I know what happened to Egypt when they tried to crush the people of God," Azariah said sharply. "And I know what happened to Babylon when they mocked his name. And I know what happens when Judah forgets who her deliverer is." Ahaz stepped closer. "And I know what happens when kings don't adapt. I won't be another fool swinging a sword at giants with no allies and empty storehouses." "You were offered an ally," the priest said, voice rising for the first time, "through the prophet Isaiah, a sign from the heavens, an open invitation to trust the Lord himself, and you rejected it." Ahaz felt the sting in his chest but refused to show it. He turned his back and faced the carved pillars of the chamber. It was never that simple. "It was exactly that simple," Azariah said, the fire in his voice now burning. "But pride makes the simple sound foolish, and fear makes obedience feel like suicide." Ahaz turned back, eyes narrowed. "I didn't come for a sermon. I came for your cooperation." Azariah met his gaze without blinking. "Then you came to the wrong priest." The room fell into a heavy, sacred silence. Outside, footsteps of priests and Levites echoed through the courtyard, oblivious to the clash happening inside. Ahaz stared at the man before him, this relic from another time, this pillar of tradition, this stubborn old priest who would rather see the temple burned than share it with false gods. And for a moment, something inside the king cracked, but not enough. He stepped back, gathering his robe. "Then I'll find one who will," he said, his voice like frost. Azariah didn't chase him, didn't plead. He only bowed his head. "May the Lord have mercy on Judah." Ahaz left without a word, but his heart didn't feel victorious. It felt hollow, like a cave where echoes outnumber truth. He would find another priest. He would give the Assyrians what they wanted. He would secure his throne, his city, his name. But what would be left of his soul? The sun had barely risen when Ahaz summoned Uriah, one of the younger priests from a noble line, but with a heart still soft from flattery and a desire to rise. Unlike Azariah, Uriah was eager to please, and Ahaz knew it. They met in the outer palace, just beneath the shade of the cedar ceiling beams, where the sound of birdsong was muted by the heaviness of the king's next decision. Uriah stood nervously at the edge of the marble floor, glancing at the guards posted like shadows against the pillars. He had been called before, but never like this. Never privately, never urgently. Ahaz didn't speak right away. He stood at the edge of the map table, fingers tracing the carved borders of Judah as if trying to memorize the shape of something slipping from his control. "Do you know what they say about me?" he asked suddenly, not looking up. Uriah shifted. "You are the Lord's anointed." Ahaz gave a short, bitter laugh. "They say I'm weak, that I make treaties instead of war, that I give silver to pagans and bow to foreign gods. They call me coward behind their smiles." "I don't believe them," Uriah offered, almost too quickly. "Doesn't matter," Ahaz said, straightening. "I don't need their approval. I need their silence. And for that, I need power. The kind Assyria can offer, but they've made it clear tribute is not enough. They want loyalty, proof." Uriah nodded, though he didn't yet understand where this was going. Ahaz took a scroll from the table and unfurled it. A detailed drawing lay inside. An altar, massive and strange. Not the golden one patterned after Moses' command. This was something different, darker, grand and cold, like the monuments of Damascus. "I saw this when I visited Tiglath-Pileser," Ahaz said, his eyes fixed on the image. "The priests of Syria bowed before it, and the people followed. The king called it a gift from his gods, a symbol of dominance." He turned to Uriah. "I want it built in Jerusalem." Uriah hesitated, his mouth opening slightly. "In the temple?" "In the temple," Ahaz repeated, "and not beside the old altar. Replace it. This is our future now. Our survival depends on it." The pause that followed was long and dangerous. Uriah's face flickered with something, hesitation, confusion, perhaps even fear, but when he finally spoke, his voice was even. "It will be done, my king." Ahaz gave a slow nod. "I knew you'd understand." That afternoon the measurements were taken. Craftsmen were summoned in secret. Stones were carved. Bronze was poured. Within days, the altar of the Lord, the one patterned after heaven, the one Solomon had knelt before, was pushed aside like old furniture in a room being redecorated. Uriah oversaw the construction personally, offering nervous prayers while shaping something he didn't fully believe in. And when the new altar was complete, Ahaz was the first to offer a sacrifice on it, but it wasn't to the God of Israel. It was to the gods of Assyria, burnt offerings lit with trembling hands and ambition disguised as progress. Smoke rose from the courtyard that day, black and thick. And though the people didn't speak of it openly, many turned their faces away when they passed the temple. The sound of singing faded. The scent of holy incense disappeared. The courts of the Lord no longer felt like home. Inside, Ahaz stood beside the foreign altar, staring into its flames. For a moment, he felt a surge of pride. He had done it. He had secured his alliance, made peace with his enemies, proven that he could be a modern king. But then the wind shifted. The smoke curled back toward him, stinging his eyes. He coughed, stepping back, blinking against the bitterness. And somewhere deep within, beneath the politics, beneath the pride, he felt something tighten. A thread he couldn't name had snapped. But there was no turning back now. At first it was barely noticeable. The temple still opened each morning. Smoke still rose from the altar, just not the one God had commanded. Priests still moved about the courts, robes swaying, lips murmuring rehearsed prayers. But something had changed. You could feel it in the air, like the stillness before a storm, like the echo of a once vibrant song whose final note hung unanswered in the wind. In the streets, people still bought grain and olives. Children still chased goats through narrow alleys, but they no longer sang the old songs, the ones about the Red Sea parting or the Lord's mighty hand stretched over Zion. Even the merchants who once called out blessings over their scales now spoke in hushed tones. The name of Yahweh became something spoken in private, behind closed doors, as if saying it too loud might bring trouble. Ahaz didn't notice at first. He was too busy entertaining messengers from Damascus and Samaria, holding court with slick diplomats who smiled too easily and praised his progress. They called him wise, flexible, forward-thinking. They told him that faith could evolve, that gods could mix like wine, Judah's god, Assyria's gods, whoever offered the better protection, and Ahaz, desperate to be respected, drank it all in. But the silence of the people began to grow louder than their praise. It was in the way the elders no longer gathered outside the temple gates to recite the Psalms, in the way women who used to hum melodies while grinding wheat now worked in silence, their eyes dark with worry. It was in the way even the Levites, once proud to carry the name of the Lord, now looked over their shoulders before entering the sanctuary. And it was most painfully seen in the eyes of the children, those who no longer asked, "What does this festival mean?" or "Tell me again about the ark." Instead, they asked about the statues, why some looked like lions, why others had faces like birds, why their neighbors no longer worshipped the way they used to. One afternoon, Ahaz stood on the palace balcony overlooking the temple courtyard. The great bronze altar from Damascus gleamed in the sun, and Uriah moved busily beneath it, preparing another sacrifice. Ahaz turned to one of his advisors. "Do you hear that?" The man paused. "Hear what, my king?" "That's just it," Ahaz muttered. "Nothing. No singing. No sound of cymbals or harps, just ashes." The advisor gave a tight smile. "Perhaps silence means contentment. The people trust you, sire. They no longer need noise to feel secure." Ahaz wanted to believe that. He truly did. But something inside him itched, a memory he couldn't quite suppress. He remembered standing in the crowd as a young prince during Passover. His father, Jotham, had led the procession, his voice lifting the sacred songs into the night sky, and the people had followed with such power it felt like the stars themselves might lean in to listen. There had been color, music, life, but now there was only smoke. And Ahaz hated silence, because when it stretched long enough, it had a way of exposing your soul. That evening he ordered the construction of new shrines across the hills of Judah. "If they won't worship in the temple," he said with a shrug, "let them worship somewhere else. Let the gods of every land feel welcome here. Surely someone will hear us." The shrines were built, the altars multiplied. The gods of Moab, Edom, and even Babylon found new homes among Judah's hills. Ahaz told himself he was uniting the kingdom, that his legacy would be one of inclusion and strength, but the silence only deepened. And somewhere far beyond the palace walls, in a forgotten part of the city, an old widow whispered a prayer beside her cold hearth. She had lit no lamp that night. She had no offering to bring. But with trembling hands and a broken voice, she still said the name of the Lord. Yahweh, one voice, one flicker, in the dark, and heaven heard. It began with rumors. A prophet had entered the city, tall, weathered, unbending like an olive tree in a storm. He wasn't flashy like the priests of the new altars or mysterious like the seers imported from Damascus. He didn't come with trumpets or scrolls or processions, just a voice. But what a voice it was! They said his name was Isaiah, that he walked right through the outer courts of the temple without bowing to the gleaming foreign altars, that he spoke words older than the stones beneath his feet, that he wept when he saw the people lighting incense to gods who had no breath, and that eventually he stood in the throne room of Ahaz himself. Ahaz didn't want to see him, not really, but Isaiah didn't ask for permission. He appeared in the middle of a council meeting as if summoned by something greater than protocol. The room quieted when he entered. Even the guards stood still. "King Ahaz," Isaiah said, his voice calm but carrying like thunder across a dry valley. "You sit on David's throne, but you've forgotten David's God." Ahaz narrowed his eyes, not standing, not bowing. "And you walk into my court with riddles and rebuke, prophet?" Isaiah didn't flinch. "I walk in with mercy, but that window is closing." Ahaz glanced at his advisors, then forced a chuckle. "Mercy looks an awful lot like judgment when it comes from your kind." Isaiah stepped forward. "You're afraid. Afraid of Aram. Afraid of Israel. Afraid of the empire to the north. So you make alliances. You build idols. You sacrifice what is holy to preserve what is fading." The air grew tense. One advisor reached for his sword, but Ahaz waved him off. "What do you want from me, Isaiah? A sermon? A sacrifice?" "I want you to stop leaning on nations and start leaning on God," Isaiah said sharply. "Ask him for a sign, Ahaz, anything, heaven above or depths below." Ahaz's face tightened. "I will not test the Lord." Isaiah shook his head slowly. "You already are." He turned then, not in anger, but in sorrow. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, God with us." Ahaz stood, his voice rising. "Enough of your poetry. I have made my decisions. Judah will survive through strength, through alliances, through wisdom." Isaiah's eyes burned. "Then you will have your strength, and it will turn to chains. You will have your alliances, and they will betray you. You will have your wisdom, and it will be your ruin." Silence fell like a stone. Then Isaiah turned and walked out, his sandals echoing across the floor like drum beats from another world. That night, Ahaz didn't sleep. Not because of Isaiah's words, but because they rang too close to something he had long tried to silence: the truth. Ahaz had inherited more than just the crown from his fathers. He had inherited their secrets. Late one night, when the noise of the city was hushed and even the priests had gone to bed, he lit a single torch and descended the old stone stairwell beneath the palace. No guards, no advisors, just the weight of Isaiah's voice echoing in his chest. The steps led to a forgotten cellar, one built generations ago during the reign of Solomon, when wisdom still ruled the land. Few knew it existed. Even fewer had dared enter. It was said to house relics of the old worship, untouched scrolls, untainted utensils, and sacred carvings covered long ago when idol altars took their place in the public squares. Ahaz's sandals scraped softly on the ancient floor as the torchlight danced across dusty stone. In one corner stood a wooden chest, bound in rusted bronze. He knelt, lifted the lid, and saw it. A robe trimmed with blue thread, the kind priests once wore when God still dwelled in the Holy of Holies. Beneath it, a broken jar of oil, a tarnished lamp, and a fragment of what seemed to be a psalm etched on clay. He read the faded inscription aloud. Some trust in chariots, and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. He stared at the words, fingers tightening around the shard. Part of him wanted to shatter it against the wall, erase it like a bad memory. But another part wanted to believe it again, the way he might have when he was a child, when he stood beside his father Jotham during festivals and watched the smoke rise straight to heaven. Back then, the temple still felt like home. Now, it was a stage for politics, for image, for gods that promised results and demanded only loyalty, not holiness. Ahaz leaned back against the stone wall and sighed. I tried to do what was smart, he muttered into the quiet. I made deals, kept Judah afloat. No one thanks a king for trusting a God they can't see. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the torchlight flickered, and he thought he saw something, or someone, move in the shadow. But when he looked again, it was only stone. Still, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He stood quickly, placed the clay shard back in the box, and shut the lid with more force than necessary. He didn't want to come down here again. He didn't want to remember that once Judah had trusted in something more than swords and silver. But as he climbed the stairs again, the word stayed with him. Some trust in chariots. That night he ordered more gold sent to Assyria, and with it, a personal letter to King Tiglath-Pileser. A plea, a promise, a price, and the first step towards something he could never take back. The letter was sent, sealed with the royal emblem of Judah. The messengers rode out under cover of dawn, 3 men on fast horses, carrying not only a king's plea for protection, but treasures stripped from the very house of God. Within weeks the reply came. Ahaz stood in the upper courtyard of the palace, surrounded by ministers. The messenger, sweating and wind-worn, knelt and handed him a scroll. He broke the seal. To Ahaz, king of Judah, the letter began. We have heard your cry. We will answer. You are now a servant of Assyria. We will protect what is ours. Ahaz swallowed. It didn't say ally. It didn't say friend. It said servant. The ministers pretended not to notice. They celebrated, clapped, praised the king's diplomacy. But Ahaz's jaw clenched. That night, another letter was sent. This time, not to a throne, but to the high priest in Jerusalem. It read only this: prepare to remodel the temple. The temple gates opened before dawn, not for prayer, not for sacrifice, but for change. Ahaz arrived flanked by guards, not priests. His robes were stiff with gold thread, his voice firm and unbending. I want it to look like the altar in Damascus, he told Uriah, the priest. Remove the bronze altar. Place mine in its place. Uriah hesitated. But that altar is... I don't want excuses, Ahaz said. I want results. Do it. Workers came. They took measurements. They chiseled away sacred stone, dismantled Solomon's craftsmanship, and replaced it with a design modeled after the gods of Assyria. The people noticed. Whispers spread through the city like wildfire. He's changing the temple. He's copying pagan altars. Is the Lord still here? But no one dared speak too loudly. Not while guards stood at the gates. Not while Ahaz walked the temple courts like he owned the heavens themselves. A few days later, Ahaz returned to inspect the changes. The altar gleamed in the sunlight, foreign, polished, cold. He walked past the priests, barely glancing at them. "Sacrifice here from now on," he ordered, "not there." Uriah nodded with a lowered gaze, obeying orders with a hollow look in his eyes. No one said it aloud, but something was gone. The hush that once fell over the courts before the presence of God, gone. The joy that rose with the songs of the Levites, silenced. In its place was the sound of hammers, coins, and a king whose heart had traded awe for alliances. That evening, Ahaz stood on the palace balcony overlooking Jerusalem. From there, he could see the temple, his version of it, modified, protected, political. He told himself he had saved Judah. He told himself it was necessary. But deep down, beneath the politics and armor and logic, something trembled. Something sacred had been touched, and it would not go quietly. It began with the doors. The temple doors, once open to the people of Judah at dawn and filled with prayer at twilight, were closed. Not for repair, not for rest, but by royal decree. Soldiers stood guard at the gates, not Levites. And inside, the smoke of foreign sacrifices rose into the air like a slow, choking warning. Priests whispered in alleys instead of pulpits. Worshippers scattered, not because they lost faith in God, but because their king had lost faith in him first. At first, Ahaz pretended not to notice. He walked past the closed sanctuary with his chin high, telling himself that safety was better than sanctity, that reform was better than ritual, that the people would thank him in time. But in truth, Judah was coming apart at the seams. Trade slowed. Families stopped bringing offerings. The feasts of the Lord became awkward affairs with half-hearted songs and fewer pilgrims. Even the vineyards seemed to produce less joy, less sweetness, less hope. Then came the rumors. A village in the south refuses to pay taxes. The northern tribes say the covenant is broken. Some say the Lord no longer dwells in Jerusalem. Ahaz dismissed them, one by one. He gathered more gold, sent more tribute to Assyria, told his advisors to silence the prophets. But one morning, he awoke to a silence that even he couldn't ignore. His son had stopped speaking. He was only a boy, no older than 10, but something in his eyes had shifted. Once, the boy would sit in the courtyard and ask questions about the God of David. Now, he avoided the temple altogether. The boy's tutor bowed nervously before the king. "Your Majesty." He won't recite the Psalms. He won't pray. Ahaz's voice sharpened. "Why?" "I don't know," the tutor said, trembling. "He says he doesn't know who to pray to anymore." The king dismissed him with a wave, but the words lodged like a thorn in his chest. He went to the boy's room that night, sat at the edge of the stone bench and looked at his son in the flickering light of an oil lamp. "You know you're going to be king someday," Ahaz said gently. The boy nodded. "Then you'll need strength. You'll need wisdom. You'll need to trust the gods who protect us." The boy's voice was quiet. "Which ones?" Ahaz blinked. "The Lord of Israel? Or the ones from Damascus? Or the ones you offered to last week?" The king stared at the floor. "You don't understand, son. I do what I must for peace." The boy looked at him, wide-eyed and sad. But peace with who? That night, sleep did not come. Ahaz tossed on his bed, wrestling not with enemies, but with emptiness. The throne room had grown colder, the palace more distant, and now even his son, his legacy, was beginning to ask the very question he'd buried under gold and foreign treaties. Had he lost what truly mattered? The fire roared louder than the voices, louder than the beating of drums, louder than the scream he would never forget. Ahaz stood beneath the shadow of a great stone idol, its arms stretched out, seared black from years of sacrifice. The valley echoed with chants. A priest from a foreign land raised his hands toward the sky, his voice thick with smoke and ceremony. And at the king's feet, bound and silent, knelt a boy, his own son. This was not the first time Ahaz had stood in that valley. He had visited the altars of Moloch before, watched from a distance as others offered their children in exchange for harvests, for military victories, for favor from foreign kings. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. This time, it was his blood on the stones. He had convinced himself that this was what kings did, that this was what strong men did when the world threatened to fall apart. His advisors whispered that Assyria would not protect him forever, that Judah's enemies still circled like vultures, that the people no longer feared their king, and worse, no longer feared his gods. So Ahaz made a choice, not of faith, but of desperation. "Give the gods something they cannot ignore," the priest had told him, "then they will owe you." And in his warped reasoning, Ahaz believed it. Believed that one act of devotion, one unforgettable offering, could buy him power he could not hold on to by force alone. But as the fire was lit and the boy's body was taken from him, something shattered deep inside his chest. His mind blurred, his knees weakened. The chants, once intoxicating, now sickened him. He saw faces in the flames, not gods, but ancestors, not spirits, but the hollow stares of prophets long silenced. Isaiah, Micah, his own grandfather, Uzziah, who had once stood in the temple and worshipped the God of Israel with trembling joy. And for one terrible moment, Ahaz realized the truth. He had not gained power. He had lost everything. That night, he returned to the palace alone. No one greeted him. No songs were sung. No feast awaited. Even the servants avoided his eyes. He sat in the corner of the throne room, still in the ash-stained garments from the valley, his crown beside him on the floor. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of his own undoing. He had traded the voice of the living God for the silence of stone, traded covenant for convenience, traded his own child for a lie that whispered of strength but delivered only sorrow. He had thought the gods would owe him, but all he was left with was smoke. In the chamber across the courtyard, his younger son, Hezekiah, lay awake, eyes wide in the dark. He had heard things. He had seen the torches flickering in the valley from his window, and though no one said it out loud, he knew something terrible had happened. He whispered into the night, clutching the worn corner of a blanket embroidered with scripture his mother had sewn long ago. "God of David, if you're still there, please don't leave us like this." The palace halls felt colder now, though the summer heat outside still pressed against the stone walls like a clenched fist. Servants moved quieter. Curtains stayed drawn. The once lively courtyard stood hushed, as if mourning something no one dared name. Even the scribes, once bustling with scrolls and royal decrees, had slowed their pens. The silence had weight. And Hezekiah felt every ounce of it. He had not spoken to his father in days, not since the fire, Not since the gods of the nations had taken what could never be returned. No one said what happened. No one had to. The boy's absence at the table, the change in Ahaz's eyes, the shadow that clung to every corner of the palace, it all told the truth more loudly than words ever could. Hezekiah still wore the linen sash his mother had given him, tucked discreetly under his robe. On it, stitched in threadbare gold, were the words of the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. He would whisper it sometimes in the early hours when the guard's sandals shuffled faintly outside his door and the night felt too thick to breathe through. He didn't know what to do with his pain. He was too young to change laws, too unnoticed to challenge the priests his father now trusted, but his heart stirred in ways he didn't yet understand. He began to listen to the elders who whispered of David's days, to the mothers who told stories of Moses when they thought no one was near, to the prophet Micah, who stood barefoot outside the gates and shouted warnings few wanted to hear. Hezekiah stayed in the shadows, but his heart was watching, learning, grieving, growing. One evening he slipped from his quarters and made his way through the inner courtyard. The guards let him pass. They knew he was the king's son, and besides, the king wasn't speaking much to anyone these days. Hezekiah walked to the old temple gate, the one that was half boarded and overgrown with vines. The door creaked. Inside, the holy place smelled of dust and old cedar. Cobwebs clung to the golden lampstand. The altar was bare, forgotten. He knelt anyway. There was no priest, no incense, no music, just one boy, one voice. God of my fathers, he whispered, his eyes closed tight. I don't understand what my father has done. I don't understand why the people bow to statues and why the true altar is empty. But I believe you're still listening. And if you are, use me. Someday. Somehow. Help me remember you when everyone else forgets. He didn't feel thunder. He didn't see fire. But something inside him, small, almost hidden, breathed to life. Not a roar, not yet, but a spark. And sometimes that's all God needs. Back in the royal chambers, King Ahaz stood by his window staring into the night. He had heard something. He couldn't explain it. A sound carried on the wind, like someone praying far below. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't fear. It was hope. And it made him afraid. The end didn't come in battle. No chariot stormed the gate. No prophet stood in the doorway with thunder in his voice. No thunder split the sky. When death came for King Ahaz, it was quiet. He lay alone in his stone chamber, his breath shallow, his once sharp eyes dimmed with something deeper than age. Regret had made a home there. The fire of the idols had long gone out. The nations he trusted had used him and left him empty. His alliances crumbled like clay in the sun, and as his strength failed, the silence of heaven seemed louder than the roar of any army. He called for no priest. He asked for no prophet. But Hezekiah came anyway. The boy, now nearly a man, stood at the foot of his father's bed. He no longer trembled when he entered the king's presence. He didn't flinch at the statues or the foreign symbols etched into the walls. He only looked at the man who had once loomed so large and now lay so small beneath a linen sheet. Ahaz turned his head slowly. His voice was brittle. You came. I did, Hezekiah answered. I couldn't let it end like this. The king's eyes searched his son's face. Do you hate me? Hezekiah didn't speak right away. He looked past his father to the window where the moonlight traced silver over the stone. I hated what you did, but not you. Ahaz gave a faint, bitter chuckle. It's strange. I had everything, power, alliances, temples, and yet I feel like I lost the one thing I needed most." "What's that?" Hezekiah asked gently. "Peace." The word lingered like incense in the air, heavy with the ache of years. Then Ahaz whispered, "Will you follow the gods I did?" Hezekiah stepped closer, his eyes shining not with tears, but resolve. "No, Father. I'll follow the Lord, the one you turned away from." Ahaz's eyelids fluttered. "Then maybe one of us will still be remembered." Hezekiah didn't reply. He simply knelt beside the bed and stayed until the old king took his final breath. The people mourned their king in name, but not in heart. No prophet wept at his grave. No psalm was sung at his tomb. Ahaz was buried, not in the royal tombs with his fathers, but away, separate. Fitting for a man who had lived apart from the God of his people. But as the sun rose the next morning, so did something else. Hezekiah, young, unproven, but bold, and within his chest burned a fire no false altar could claim. The first thing he did was tear them down. Every idol, every carved image, every foreign shrine his father had built, he reopened the temple. He called the Levites back. He summoned the people, not to celebrate a king, but to return to the King of heaven. And something shifted, not in politics, not in armies, but in the heart of a nation. It would take years. There would still be battles. There would still be threats. But the people had a shepherd again. And the boy who once prayed in silence now stood in the open, leading with courage, trusting the God his father had rejected. And though Ahaz was gone, the lesson of his life would live on. Because every generation chooses to trust in the world's ways or to return to the one who never left.